Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Hope your August is going great. Lots to tell you about on this week's show. And we are beginning the broadcast with a look at markets. The U.S. corn crop improved slightly this week with USDA's good to excellent ratings at 64%. Nebraska was a few ticks better at an even 70% good to excellent. The drought continues to hammer North Dakota with a good to excellent rating of only 17%. For soybeans, 76% of Nebraska's crop is good to excellent, with nationwide blooming at 91%. Earlier this week, Market Journal was out at soybean management field days. We caught up with Heartland Farm Partners President Jeff Peterson to talk markets and get his take on current crop conditions.
You know, it was actually surprising. We were actually looking for the conditions to probably be 1 to 2 lower on corn, and they ended up coming in 2 higher. The big surprise actually was Illinois popping up 11 percentage points higher on the good to excellent. So we're really kind of questioning there. So yeah, that was a surprise. Beans holding steady. It was interesting. The week before they were up a couple, then they kind of hold steady. But I think what it does speak to is just the importance as we go forward each week here of watching these conditions closely, especially North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and then over into Iowa, just to see how this crop finishes, because we're just right on the edge on moisture. We just don't really have quite enough subsoil or topsoil, so we got to continue to get timely rains or it will hurt the yield.
And yeah, speaking of timely rains, we had some storms coming through this past weekend. What has that done for the markets?
You know what, the challenging thing we always run into is it's been those pop-up showers, so it's the type of thing where if you happen to be underneath them, it definitely helped on the yield side, but there was enough of them out there that's probably what helped on the condition side. There was enough moisture that came down that kept us from seeing that lower rating coming in on the good to excellent conditions.
Okay, and as we speak, the August WASDE report is on deck. By the time this airs, it will have come out the day before. But as we look toward that report, we looking for it to really shake things up one way or another? What do you think?
You know, it sure could, because what we've got is, if you think about the yield, so we'll start first on the yield on corn. It's a change, and what I mean by a change on the yield is that all of a sudden you've kind of got WASDE handing off to NASS. So the National Ag Statistics Service, you know, they'll surveyed the farmers, asked them what they think the yields are. They've also looked at the satellite data, bring that all together so to come up with a yield. We're looking for the yield to be lower. You know, 179.5 is where the trend line yield is. You know, some of the early guesses are 176.5 in that area, so we think the yield will come down. The surprise and could shake things up if for some reason it doesn't. The other thing we're looking for is also a lower production number for Brazil. And when we see that lower production number on Brazil, in particular on the corn, then we do think there could be some increases on the export side as we reach out into the 2021 crop. It'll have to happen at some point on U.S. corn. Whether it happens in this report, probably still a little bit up in the air, but there should be some adjustments in those areas.
How much volatility do we normally see with this August report?
There can be a lot of volatility in this August one. The difference you would have is that if you go back and starting in 2019 is when things changed with those yields. It used to be the August report would have infield observations. So it's not really a revision of yield, it's a totally rebuilding of yield. And so yeah, there could be a lot of volatility with this one. We got surprised last year. Fortunately, after the report came out, the market did start moving its way higher, but you know, it could be very volatile.
And here we are in August, harvest going to be here before you know it, so maybe a good time to think about post-harvest grain marketing plan. What kind of questions should we be asking ourselves right now?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, if you start off with, let's say you've got some hedged arrives that you maybe sold earlier, the thing you have to think about is that, are those going to be on some bushels that you're going to deliver at harvest time? If they are, I don't think we want to set basis yet. If they're going to be for bushels that are going to be in the bin and be delivered later, then we'll really want to start watching those spreads between like December and March, December and July. I don't think we should roll those out yet, so let's just be patient there. The other thing we want to think about is those unsold bushels that you're going to have up and beyond maybe your stored bushels that are going to go in at harvest time. You know, we're thinking as of right now on those bushels, make sure you have storage space for them. We think we're going to want to go ahead and store those bushels as opposed to selling them off the combine. but we'll have to watch yields to see for sure. And then on anything that you've got that you've already sold ahead that you have the basis open for, that's going to be delivery, maybe it's out in December, January, February, we still want to be patient on the basis levels there yet too.
And speaking of basis, if you want to dig a little deeper into that, what's basis looking like for corn and soybeans right now?
Right now what we're doing, starting first on the corn side, we're seeing a little bit of strength come back in that market. I think some of these ethanol plants still need a few bushels yet, but if you've got some old crop to move, take advantage of that basis that we're having some strength there. As we come into this fall and into basically stuff's being delivered off the combine, I think we're going to have some really good, strong basis levels. We're starting to see China come back in on the soybean market, and they're starting to buy some more soybeans. They've already got some on the books, but the U.S. is cheap now on the bean side. We're very competitive, so I think we'll see sales improve there. That'll help our basis level. And so I think over on the corn side, the ethanol plants, like we talked about, will take that push. But then be careful in there, because once they get filled, they will sit back and wait a little bit and wait for some cheaper bushels to come in, but then we'll see some improvement after harvest again.
All right, you touched on China. What are exports looking like right now? What do we need to know? Yeah,
on the export side, you know what, we're moving along decent. On the corn side first, we know that there's going to be some bushels that they aren't going to get them all shipped out. So on the corn side, there'll be some of their old crop corn bushels for the export side will get moved over to the new crop side. On the beans, we're going to continue to start seeing shipments pick up there also on the export to China. We want to watch China really close on the corn side though, just to make sure that the demand that everybody thinks they're going to have shows up, and that'll be when we see those bushels shipped.
Saw you do a tweet about fund positions in corn. Talk a little bit about that. What's the story there?
Yeah, on the fund side, the funds still want to be buyers of the corn. They just haven't taken a big position. I think there's enough uncertainty out there yet. We would expect as we go forward, especially if the yields come down, to see them come back into that market and be a bigger buyer. We also think that could happen over on the soybean side, but it's going to take maybe just a little bit more time there yet. There's still a lot more uncertainty about the bean yield yet, only because August rains is what's going to really determine whether or not we've got a good bean crop or not.
All right, great info as always today. Let's end it with any marketing or risk management advice that you want to leave us with.
So I think the big thing coming into harvest time here is just really think about, okay, as we're getting closer, what is my break evens on my grain? Think about what's going to trigger your sales as we come in here. And also, if you don't have bushels sold, you're going to have to take them to town. Really think about, what you're going to do with those bushels when you get them brought in. Our recommendation as of right now would be to consider storage as opposed to selling them or a basis contract.
Next week, we'll be joined by Iowa State University's Chad Hart for a special look at carbon markets. Make sure you tune in for that. And just a quick word on the hog markets this week, too. African swine fever continues to make news, and not in a good way. Latest reports put the disease in the Dominican Republic. That's 800 miles from the coast of Florida, and the first time the outbreak of ASF has been in the Western Hemisphere in nearly 40 years. University of Missouri livestock economist Scott Brown says U.S. hog producers should have a level of concern, but also to keep things in perspective.
I keep saying this is a hard one for me because it's 0-1. There's no partially getting ASF in the United States. We're at 0. Maybe the probability goes up when you see it in the Western Hemisphere, but I don't want to overstate it. I think it's a pretty marginal increase. It might in fact make us maybe be more cautious again about all the protocols that we have in place to make sure ASF does not enter the United States. But the day, if it were to happen, will be a terrible day for us. It's such a 0-1 though. It's hard to say. Having it in the Dominican Republic has made a lot of difference in terms of longer term hog prices. If that were to continue to move in the Western Hemisphere, we're going to want to pay a little closer attention to what it might mean for the United States moving forward.
Pork and pork products from the Dominican Republic are currently prohibited entry into the U.S. as a result of existing swine fever restrictions. Market Journal has been following the spread of ASF for quite some time now, and we will continue to do so. Next up, while most producers are done with their pesticide treatments this season, it's still important to keep checking those fields to reduce the risk of future infestations. Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with Extension Entomologist Jeff Peterson to see what pests producers should be on the lookout for through the end of the growing season.
Many row crop producers have successfully applied pesticide applications to their fields, and doing so have come a step closer to improving those yield totals for the 2021 growing season. However, just because spraying's been completed doesn't mean the work is entirely over. In fact, in July, many producers saw a very high rate of western bean cutworm moth infestation.
So we have had a really big flight of the western bean cutworm moths in Nebraska this year, especially in areas kind of in the west central part of the state. We actually had a record of over 1,200 moths in one night collected in the North Platte blacklight trap. That's the most that we've had in the last 8 summers. Kind of accordingly with those large flights, we also saw pretty high infestation rates. Our economic threshold is 5 to 8% of plants infested. And we saw fields above that economic threshold pretty regularly in the west central and central and a little bit into the south central parts of the state of Nebraska.
Western bean cutworms and corn rootworm beetles are an annual problem in some areas of the state. Even though pesticide applications have been made, it is paramount to continue scouting fields to make sure the treatments were effective and to ensure you're not experiencing any flare-ups of spider mites.
So most of those treatments would have already gone out in the state of Nebraska. It is important to follow up, however, if you have sprayed insecticides in your fields, especially if you're in an area that has like sandy, well-draining soils where your crops may be exposed to some drought stress, because those fields are going to be more susceptible to having spider mite outbreaks. We do see that with applications of insecticides. Whether those insecticides are targeting western bean cutworm or maybe corn rootworm beetles, that those insecticides can remove the beneficial insects out there, the things like predatory mites or lady beetles that are helping to keep the spider mites in check. And without those good guys there kind of keeping them in control, those spider mites can really flare up. So I do recommend checking your fields, especially those that have been sprayed for spider mite flare-ups. And it's always good to also check and see how effective your applications were, whether you were targeting corn rootworm or targeting western bean cutworm. Follow up and see, did the products work? What was your treatment approach there effective?
If you do happen to notice a flare-up of spider mites, you may not necessarily need to treat. That is unless you notice an infestation encroaching the economic threshold.
For spider mites in corn, the economic threshold is when you find that yellow or white stippling, that's sort of that discoloration, kind of spotty discoloration that you can see on the leaves that's caused from the mites. If the lower third of the plant has that stippling, and then mite colonies are found in the middle third of the plant, the height of the mite colonies is sort of pushing vertically up to the height of the ear leaf. That's what we consider to be an economic threshold for spider mites in corn. If you're looking at spider mites in soybeans, the economic threshold there is when the lower third of the plant has that heavy stippling, that's that heavy kind of yellow and white discoloration. You might see some leaf loss in that lower third of the canopy. The middle third of the plant will have some stippling and mites present. And then you'll find scattered mite colonies on the upper third of the plant, up in the top third of the canopy. And that's what we consider the economic threshold, the time when you would need to treat for spider mites in soybeans.
Likewise, when it comes to corn rootworm beetles, odds are, if you've had a problem, it's been treated already. However, with this particular pest, you're going to want to keep an eye on any remaining adult beetles in order to try to reduce the number of eggs they could lay, which could be problematic during the next growing season.
However, if you're a bit later down in pollination, what you're doing in terms of beetle management would actually be to target the beetles to reduce their numbers so that they're reducing egg laying in terms of how much larval pressure will be in that field next year if you plan to keep that field in corn in the following year. So an economic threshold that you can use for corn rootworm beetles, if you're talking about reducing egg laying, reducing pressure for next year, is if there's 0.75 beetles per plant during scouting, or if you're catching 6 beetles per trap per day, if you're using yellow sticky cards that have been placed out in the fields. As far as things that you can do this year, most of that would be like aerial or chemigation application of insecticides. And that again is going to be important to think about which products you're using. In the western part of the state, we have seen considerable problems with some of the pyrethroid insecticides, with western corn rootworm having developed resistance to those. So again, you want to be careful about your product choice and look for an active ingredient that is going to be effective against the beetles. And then also keep in mind not trying to flare spider mites as well with your applications.
As we reach the finish line of yet another growing season, it's imperative that producers keep a close eye on these pests in order to game plan for next year. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. Julie says if you're experiencing problems with corn rootworm beetles at this point in the season, it might be worth switching any infested fields to a non-corn crop next year, as this pest feeds exclusively on corn and will eventually be starved out. You can find more information on these pests and treatment recommendations at cropwatch.unl.edu. Moving on now, and we've told you before about the 4 R's of nutrient management and fertilizer application. Say them along with me: right source, right rate, right time, and right place. But the 4 R's practices can be applied toward water stewardship too. That means taking the steps to address the problem nitrates and leaching play in Nebraska groundwater and surface water.
So when we're looking at surface water, the most common impairment we have in Nebraska's lakes is going to be nutrients. So it's going to be both the nitrogen and the phosphorus entering the lakes. And when we get that combination, it's going to manifest itself in things like algae blooms and harmful algae blooms, which are blue-green algae. And so we might also see things like over excessive aquatic vegetation in a lake. Groundwater, by far and away, the number one concern we have is going to be nitrate. As a farmer, you're really responsible for the own quality of your water, both whether it's going through your irrigation system or through your livestock, and even in your own personal domestic well coming into your household. You really have to take responsibility for that water quality. So the best thing that farmers can do is at least once a year, you want to take a sample of your household drinking water and make sure that you are not climbing in nitrate and you don't have any E. coli problem. When it comes to sampling for your irrigation, you really need to do a little bit more intensive look at how your system is handling the water quality, because the different presence of different contaminants in the water can actually implicate how well the water goes out and how effective what you're putting out is.
Katie says that it's important to remember good water quality is essential to strong rural and urban communities. For more information on water sample testing and other resources, visit water.unl.edu. Next up, longtime Nebraska Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson recently retired. You've probably seen Bruce on Market Journal many times in the past, but Bruce left a lasting legacy reminding producers about the importance of forage production in the state, not only to livestock producers, but also to forage farmers. Agriculture and technologies have changed over the 42 years that Dr. Anderson worked in his position, but the overall goals of farmers in raising high-quality forages hasn't changed. You can read more about Bruce's insights as he reflects on his career in the August issue of Nebraska Farmer. And what do you say we get some insights on this week's forecast with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher? Al, what's the big weather story for the week ahead?
Well, Troy, after a very hot start to the week, we've finally seen that cold front come through that was advertised last week. It came through about 24 hours later than what was originally forecasted. So we held the heat, at least in southeastern and east central Nebraska, much longer than the models anticipated. But we finally broke those upper 90-degree readings and those very high dew points with the cold front that came through. And for the first time in a long time, the models are actually showing a very promising trend in regards to precipitation. In fact, pretty much every day there's chances for precipitation once we get into the middle of the end of next week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store as we go through this next 7-day period. First thing I'll draw your attention to is the high pressure system is now in the upper atmosphere is now shifted off to the west. We have this trough that's basically sitting up over the Great Lakes. And this will intensify as we go through the weekend. So basically high pressure is in control over the southeastern United States. We do get some return flow up into our region. And the GFS model is showing the development of thunderstorms rolling down the Missouri River Valley. And we'll see that trend continue on as this high pressure system just basically sits stationary. We still have the front of that trough, or the back of that trough, excuse me, the Great Lakes, sitting over eastern Nebraska. And so the GFS model once again is also indicating the potential for another piece of energy to run about that ridge and run down the eastern half of the state. Now as we go into Monday, we see that ridge trying to spread its way back into western Nebraska. We'll probably see our temperatures return to the 90s, lower to mid 90s, but in the east we'll probably be stuck more into the upper 80s. But yet again, another piece of energy looks like it's going to pivot around that ridge and hit the eastern part of the state. Now, by the time we get to Tuesday, we start to see this large trough moving across the northern plains, and that's going to be our cool down as we get later in the week. But low pressure sits up in the eastern portions of South Dakota. We don't have a lot of return moisture, but there is the opportunity at least to get some scattered thunderstorm activity, very sparsely across our region. On Wednesday, though, this trough starts to dig deeper, so the high pressure is pushing behind it, low pressure over the Texas Panhandle, Gulf moisture feeds northward. We should see a line of convection developing from the western Great Lakes all the way through southwestern Nebraska. And on Thursday, this trough ever so slowly pivots toward the Great Lakes. So we are going to continue to see a fetch of moisture from the south coming in at the lower layers of the atmosphere. We will also have, basically with that trough, moisture converging along that system, so we are going to have a chance for, again, the eastern half of the state seeing scattered thunderstorm activity. And then on Friday, we get more of a zonal flow. We might start to see just a slight warm up in temperatures, but low pressure looks like it's going to form in the northwestern part of the state and right eastward. That's going to push that colder air and the cold front to the east of us, but notice that we see this moisture returning. As this system pushes to the east, we'll start to see monsoon flow take into shape. That's going to start moving moisture up into the central Rockies, and we have another trough that looks like it's going to come through the northern plains as we go into the last week of August, and that's going to generate once again renewed thunderstorm activity for our region. So if we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, you can see that the heat is being pushed to the east as we start to see high pressure forming over the eastern United States. Cold to our west was kind of a change from what we've been seeing. And in terms of precipitation, for the first time in a long time, well above normal moisture for most of the Corn Belt as we see a series of impulses ejecting out of that trough coming in from the Pacific Northwest.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, we know that cattle communicate with each other, that much is obvious, but what if we were able to understand what they were saying, or mooing? Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh has more on this story.
These cattle calls may sound similar, but they come from different cows in different situations. Alexandra Green, a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney in Australia, has been studying cows' individual voices in order to learn more about their welfare.
The study of bioacoustics has been done for decades in a range of wildlife and mammalian species, but more recently, studies have been looking at livestock and the emotional content of their voices, so more particularly in pigs, horses, and goats. However, knowledge of cattle vocal communication is relatively limited. And now that we've got all of these advanced analysis techniques and new insights from other animal species, we can study really in-depth cattle vocal communication.
The data collection part of her research was a long and delicate process. Throughout the process, the cows were placed in different social situations, both positive and negative, in order to hear how they would react.
The process is relatively long. It involves me going out into the field with a shotgun microphone and recording the cattle in response to different farming contexts where they're likely to vocalize. So when they were eligible for mating, when they were excited over a feed reward, when they were then denied this feed access, and then because they are very social, we also recorded them when they were isolated from their herd mates with and without vision of their herd mates.
Once the data had been collected, Alexandra traveled to France, where she worked with bioacousticians in order to analyze the cows' voices.
Essentially, you import the sound data and you bring up the waveforms of the sounds, and you can look and extract a range of different vocal features. So I looked at 21 different vocal features, things such as the duration of the sound, the pitch, the variation of the pitch throughout the call, how loud the vocalization sounded, how rough it sounded, and any abrupt jumps between the pitch. And then I analyzed all of that data and then did the statistical analyses after that.
After all the analyzation was done, Alexandra was able to confirm that cows do have individual voices that do not vary from situation to situation.
But the more novel and interesting finding is that this individuality is stable across contexts. The cows were able to maintain their individual distinctiveness of their voice across the positive and negative contexts. So it shows that cattle are able to recognize an individual independent of what they say. So for example, if a cow was to vocalize in anticipation of feed, her voice would be individualized and identified when she then vocalized out of isolation.
Moving forward, Alexandra says the goal is to create new technologies in the cattle industry in order to improve the welfare of the animals.
So we can actually learn a lot of information from just recording their vocalizations about the individual identity, their emotional state. So there is potential that we can, once we map out all of this information, we can develop technologies around this. Worldwide, you're seeing a trend of increasing herd sizes and a decreasing individual animal attention. So if we can develop novel techniques to analyze the welfare of cattle, then it's only going to be beneficial for the farming industry.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. Great story. While the research is still ongoing, it'll be interesting to see how much more we learn about cattle communication as time goes on. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app, or you can follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, carbon credits have been a popular topic in ag. We'll tell you what they are and if they're right for your operation. Plus, we're previewing the annual Husker Harvest Days event. See what's in store for this year's show. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.